We reached my parents' house in Buckhead exactly at 7 in the evening. The whole place smelled like one of those expensive fake pine candles that tried to hide something rotten underneath. The air was too sweet, too clean, like a scent sprayed to cover something ugly. I held Marcus's hand tightly as he carried our baby Leo close to his chest. I could feel myself getting tense before we even stepped inside. My name is Kesha, and I had just turned 30. Marcus gently rubbed the back of my hand with his thumb like he always did when he could feel me shutting down. He knew what kind of night it would be. Even from outside the front door, we could hear my sister Tiffany's loud, shrill laugh echoing through the dining room. She was already putting on her show. As soon as we stepped into the grand foyer, the mood hit us like a slap. Cold, fake, polite, with a chill just beneath the surface. My mother, Brenda, practically ran over to Tiffany with open arms, squealing in admiration. "Is that the new Balenciaga runway dress?" she asked, her voice high with excitement. "The $2,000 one? Oh, Tiffany, you look like a model straight off the cover of a magazine." She kissed her on both cheeks, her eyes sparkling. Then she turned to me, her smile faded just a little. Her eyes scanned me from top to bottom. "Ann Taylor again," she said flatly. "Well, I suppose it is neat." She gave me a one-arm hug that felt more like she was patting down a stray dog, then turned toward Marcus. "Still in uniform," she said coldly. My father Joseph walked over from the bar, his glass in hand. He clapped Marcus on the back hard enough to make it clear it wasn't friendly. "Still working for the government, son," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "That salary keeping my daughter happy. You know she likes the finer things." Marcus gave a polite smile, the kind that had no warmth behind it. "We do just fine, sir. We are happy." "Happy," he scoffed. "Happy does not buy a house in Buckhead." My father never hid how he felt about us. He built his empire with Harris Motors, one of the largest black-owned car dealership chains in Atlanta, and reminded us of that every chance he got. I was the daughter who picked numbers over business, and my husband was the man who chose honor over profit. That made us boring, and boring in this family meant failure. Tiffany and her husband Chad were the stars of every show. We were the extras. We were given our assigned seats at the long polished mahogany table, just like always. Tiffany and Chad were placed in the middle right in front of my parents. Marcus and I were pushed to the far end near the kitchen door, almost out of sight. The dining room centerpiece looked like it cost a fortune, white roses, red berries, and holly leaves stuffed into a giant golden bowl. It was so large we could barely see each other across the table, which I figured was the whole point. As soon as the wine was poured, Chad raised his glass. A toast, he said too loudly, to Harris Motors and to my next big win. "Just closed a huge deal. The returns will be massive." My mother clapped her hands in pure delight. "Oh, Chad, you are such a genius." Chad smiled like a showman. "Well, I had to get my wife something special. I got her the new matte black G-Wagon. Had to pull strings to get that one." Tiffany tossed her hair and gave a little smirk. "It is divine. We are taking it to Aspen next month. Booked the chalet at the Little Nell. Private ski lift and all." She then looked directly at me, that same fake smile on her lips. "We cannot fly commercial anymore, Kesha. The lines, the people. It is unbearable. Private jet is really the only way." "But I guess that is hard for you to understand." I smiled tightly. "Sounds nice, Tiffany. I hope you have fun." "Oh, we will," she said, quickly turning back to my parents. My father started grilling Chad on the stock market and hedge funds, while my mother asked Tiffany about her next spa visit. They never even looked our way. It was like we were not even there. Just props in their stage play. The servers brought out the main course, a giant beef tenderloin, surrounded by golden potatoes and roasted carrots. My father stood up, carving knife in hand, like he was performing brain surgery instead of cutting meat. Chad kept talking even louder than before. "You see, Joseph, most people run from risk. I run toward it. That is why I will retire by 40. And your son-in-law over there, he will still be working for pennies." He waved his glass in Marcus's direction. I felt Marcus stiffen beside me. His jaw tightened. I placed my hand on his arm to calm him. Not now, it was not worth it. I looked down at Leo, who was sitting by my feet, quietly playing on the floor. He was only 1 year old, just starting to crawl with determination. He was obsessed with the pattern on my mother's red and blue Persian rug. His tiny hands traced the shapes over and over his little coos, the only sweet sound in that room full of egos. Across from me, Tiffany waved her arms while describing her last facial. They use real gold flakes, Mom. It is heavenly. While she talked, she flung her pearl white Chanel purse onto a tiny stool next to the fireplace. The purse landed lopsided, its golden chain dangling. Then she set her glass of deep red wine on a thin, wobbly side table right beside it. I saw how close it was to the edge. I had a moment of dread. That is not going to end well, I thought, but I said nothing. What would be the point? Leo looked up. He saw the glimmering gold chain hanging just above his head. To him it was not an expensive purse. It was just a shiny thing calling his name. He began crawling toward it, passing under the table, slipping past Chad's glossy shoes. I watched, smiling a little despite everything. My son was brave, curious, full of life. He reached the stool, reached for the chain. His small hand grabbed it, and he pulled. In a single moment everything changed. The purse tipped forward, hit the small side table. The wine glass trembled, teetered, then fell. The red wine splashed through the air like a ribbon of blood and hit the white Chanel bag square in the middle. A deep crimson stain spread across the leather like an open wound. The room froze. The only sound was the soft drip of wine onto the rug. Everyone stared. My father held the carving knife in midair. Chad's mouth hung open. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls, but her eyes were locked on the bag, not my son. Tiffany turned around slowly. Her eyes scanned the scene and narrowed. She saw the purse, the stain, and then Leo. My baby boy sat on the floor, his face full of innocent confusion. She hissed one word. "You," and then she moved. I tried to speak, tried to shout, but my voice caught in my throat. Tiffany stormed across the room, raised her hand, and slapped him. Her hand, her rings, her rage crashed into his little face. The sound echoed, a crack like a whip. My son fell back, his head hitting the floor, and then he screamed, a high broken wail that shattered everything. My baby was hurt. He clutched his face, sobbing in pain. A sound of pure betrayal. I screamed too, not a word, just a roar. I lunged for her, but Chad grabbed me from behind, his arm across my neck, pulling me back. "Calm down," he hissed. "It was an accident." Tiffany was screeching. "Look what he did. My bag is destroyed. $6,000 ruined. You should be apologizing to me. I barely even touched him. You are overreacting, Kesha." I stopped struggling, looked at my mother, eyes full of pain. She shut her eyes side and said, "Stop making a scene. It is Christmas. You are upsetting everyone." I turned to my father. He would understand, but he only cleared his throat. "Now, Tiffany," he said, "you should not have done that. And Kesha, you really need to watch your son." That was it. That was all. Leo kept sobbing. Chad held me back. Tiffany hugged her purse, and everyone else just sat there. They chose silence. They chose her. Over my baby, over blood. Then came the sound that split through the thick, heavy silence like a sharp knife, dragging across glass, the long, slow scrape of a wooden chair leg, pulling back against the polished floor. And even though Chad still had his arm wrapped around my chest, trying to hold me still, everyone in that room turned their heads toward the sound because they knew what it meant. Marcus was rising. He was not rushing, not panicking, not shouting. He was just standing up, slowly, calmly, fully. And when he did, the entire air in the room seemed to shift. Marcus stood at 6'3", and that night he was wearing his formal military dress, blues, the dark fabric sharp, and unwrinkled, the silver eagle insignia gleaming on his shoulders, marking him as a full colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the elite legal division of the military to them. He had always just been my husband, the man, they mocked, the little Soldier with the government job, but when he stood up that night in full uniform, calm and collected, their expressions changed. They were not looking at the quiet man in the background anymore. They were looking at power, and every spoiled word, every condescending joke they had ever thrown his way suddenly hung in the air like regret. Marcus walked with quiet command, his steps slow, deliberate, his eyes locked only on Leo, who was still lying on the floor, still screaming with pain and fear. Marcus knelt beside our son, his movements precise, like every action was practiced, every second intentional. He cradled Leo's face, gently wiped the tears with his thumb, and we all saw it then. There on Leo's soft brown cheek was the red outline of a full adult hand, a perfect imprint, swollen and bruising, the skin already turning dark around the edges, and beneath his tiny lip was a cut likely from the ring Tiffany wore so proudly. A drop of blood had dried there, and my heart clenched so tightly I thought I would collapse. Marcus examined Leo with care, said nothing, but his eyes, when they looked at that wound, were cold, not angry, not hot with rage, but icy and precise, like a man logging evidence. Marcus picked Leo up with one smooth movement, holding him close. The baby buried his face into his father's uniform, his sobs quieter, now muffled against the safety of that blue fabric. Then Marcus stood again, and this time he turned not to me, not to my parents, but to Tiffany, who was still clutching her ruined bag, her eyes blazing with fake outrage, her lips moving as if ready to launch into another performance. Marcus's voice, when it came, was low, not loud, not wild, just flat, cold, firm, and final. "Tiffany, you just assaulted my son." The word hung in the air like smoke. It was not shouted, it was not emotional, it was legal and heavy and real. She laughed, scoffing, rolling her eyes, her voice full of sneer. "Come on, Marcus," she said, waving one hand like it was all some silly misunderstanding. "Assaulted, really? Don't bring your military terms in here. This is family. He's my nephew. I barely touched him. He was grabbing my things." Marcus did not blink. He said flatly, "He has a 5-finger print on his face and a cut on his lip. Those are injuries from a deliberate strike with your hand." His tone did not rise, it dropped lower, colder. He continued, "You will apologize to my wife, and you will apologize to my son." Now Tiffany's face froze, the blood drained just slightly from her cheeks, and she looked around the room for support. Her gaze hit my father first. Joseph cleared his throat, placed his carving knife down on the table, and stood slowly. He pointed toward Marcus with his hand, as if trying to take control. "Son, that is enough." His voice was loud, trying to sound commanding. "This is my house. I will handle this." Marcus turned toward him. His face did not change. "Sir, you had your chance to handle it. You had that chance when your daughter struck a baby, and you chose to stay silent." My father's mouth opened, then closed again, but it was my mother Brenda who erupted next. She stood up quickly, her chair rattling behind her, her fists clenched. "How dare you speak to your father like that in his house? You have no right coming in here and disrespecting him. We gave you a seat at this table, and this is how you repay us." She spat the words like venom. "You are just a government worker. You don't understand how this family works." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even look at her. He said clearly, "I am the person removing my wife and child from this dangerous house." He looked at me then, and in that moment the commander was gone. The soldier faded, and the man I loved stood there, his voice soft. "Kesha, get Leo's bag, get your coat. We are leaving." My mother screamed again, lunging toward me. She grabbed my arm hard, her nails digging into my skin. "You are not leaving. You are not walking out on this family on Christmas. This is your home too. Don't you dare, Kesha, don't you dare turn your back on us." I stared at her, her hand gripping me, her face twisted with panic, not from love, not from worry, but because she was losing control. I looked down at her hand, at her tight, desperate grasp, and I felt nothing, no guilt, no fear, just clarity. She shouted, "You are choosing him over your own blood. You are choosing this soldier over your father, over me, over Tiffany. After all we have done for you." I looked at her, then looked at Leo, whose red cheek lay against his father's chest, his tiny fingers curled into Marcus's collar. I looked at the people sitting at that table, my sister cradling a purse, my brother-in-law avoiding my eyes, my father polishing a knife. I looked at them all, and I said, "Yes, I am." I yanked my arm free, picked up my purse and the diaper bag, and walked toward the front hall. Marcus followed behind me, shielding Leo from their eyes as we walked through the door. The cold night air wrapped around us like a blessing behind me. Tiffany shouted after us, her voice cracking. Go ahead, leave, run back to your pathetic life. You'll be crawling back, begging for money. You are nothing without us. You always were. The door shut hard behind us, and the silence that followed was deeper than anything inside that house. We drove home in silence. Leo cried himself to sleep in the car seat. I kept my face turned to the window, unable to speak, unable to breathe. My baby had been struck, and my entire family had sat there and watched it happen and then blamed us for reacting. When we got home, our small, modest house felt like a fortress. I carried the ice pack from the freezer to Leo's room, while Marcus laid him gently in the crib. His cheek was swollen, his lip tender. I kissed his forehead, my eyes full of tears that would not fall. Marcus came behind me, wrapped his arms around my shoulders. We stood there watching Leo sleep, and he whispered this was never about the bag. I turned to him slowly. What do you mean? He pulled away and began pacing the living room, his voice quiet. No, I mean this whole night, this entire dinner, the wine, the speeches, the gifts. It was not about Christmas. It was a performance, a stage show. They were putting on a show for us, and they needed us to see it. I stared at him, still processing, and then it hit me like a crashing wave. He was right. The toasts, the bragging, the expensive dress, the forced smiles. It had all been a setup. They were desperate, and desperate people perform. Marcus stopped, looked at me, and said, your parents are afraid, Kesha. They are terrified. I saw it in their eyes, and that is why they let it all happen. They are not just enabling Tiffany, they are protecting her, because she knows something big. I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. And then, like a storm clearing, I saw it, the memories, the history. Every time they had asked me for something, every time I was pushed aside, every time I gave in, all the way back to high school, when I gave up my scholarship money, Tiffany's wedding, or when Marcus and I lost our first house because I gave our down payment to save her failed spa business. And every time they told me the same thing, Tiffany is just fragile. You are the strong one, we are counting on you. I was not the strong one, I was the useful one, I was the safety net, the easy target, the reliable fool who kept giving, and now I had let them hurt my son, and still they asked me to be quiet, to play along, to protect the performance, and I knew then I would never play that role again. I would never stand silently in the background while they tore us apart. I was done. And now I had something they could never predict. I had truth, and I had fire, and for the first time in my life, I would be the one to write the ending of this story. The silence of that night was quickly replaced by the sharp buzzing of my phone. The moment we stepped through our front door, the notifications came flooding in all at once, vibrating across the kitchen counter like a swarm of angry hornets. I had turned the phone on without thinking, not expecting anything, but as soon as it connected to the Wi-Fi, it lit up with message after message from the Harris family group, chat that had been mostly dormant for months, suddenly erupting into a storm of accusations and twisted stories. I stared at the screen, frozen, as the notifications kept coming. Marcus walked over, picked up the phone, and read the messages before handing it to me with a quiet look. You need to see this, he said, and then he stepped back, holding Leo, who had fallen asleep again, his tiny body limp against his father's shoulder. The first message was from my mother, her words cold, sharp and formal. Kesha, your father and I are deeply disappointed. Your behavior tonight was shameful and embarrassing. You created an unnecessary scene in front of our guests and the household staff. We raised you to be composed, to rise above moments like these. I read it again and again, my chest tightening. My mother had just witnessed her grandson being slapped by her eldest daughter, and her first reaction was not concern for his injury, but disappointment that I had reacted at all. The next message was from Tiffany, of course. Well, I hope you are happy, she wrote. My $6,000 bag is ruined and Christmas is officially destroyed. I was assaulted, screamed at, and treated like a villain in my own family. Thanks for that. Then came Chad. His message was the worst. Kesha, this whole thing was out of control. But what really concerns me is Marcus. He has anger problems, serious ones. That kind of behavior from someone in the military is dangerous. He could really hurt someone someday. He needs to check himself. I could not believe what I was reading. In less than an hour, they had rewritten reality. They had flipped the entire narrative and turned themselves into the victims. My sister, who hit A baby was now claiming she had been assaulted. My brother-in-law, who restrained me by force, had now become the concerned voice of reason, and my mother, who told me to calm down while my son cried in pain, was now the one talking about dignity. I stood there unable to speak, unable to move, as the truth of what Marcus said earlier hit me full force. This was not a family argument. This was not a moment that got out of hand. This was a coordinated preemptive strike. Marcus stood near the crib watching Leo sleep. He looked over at me and said, "Look at the timestamps," his voice calm, "and focused your mind." Sent her message at exactly 9:42. Tiffany replied 30 seconds later, Chad 10 seconds after, that this was not random. They are building their version of the story. Before we can tell the truth, they are creating a timeline that paints us as the threat. He was right. They were not just defending Tiffany, they were protecting something much bigger, and I felt that old feeling again, the cold, steady focus I knew from my work as a forensic accountant, the same feeling I got when I was hunting fraud buried in corporate spreadsheets, when I was following money trails meant to be invisible. I felt it rising now, not fear, not rage, but purpose. I walked away from the counter, entered my office, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. My hands moved on their own, instinctually logging into systems and tools I had not touched in years. They always underestimated me. My family thought I was boring. Safe, the dependable one, the dull daughter who studied accounting instead of chasing spotlight or power. But they never asked what I really did for work, what forensic accounting actually meant. I did not just look at numbers. I investigated, I tracked money. I found the cracks people tried to hide, and now I was ready to look at the one place I had never dared before, the family business, Harris Motors. I had helped my father set up his accounting software years ago during a school break, just trying to be helpful back then. I had admin level access, and of course he never changed the password. I logged into the system and opened the financial dashboard. It took less than 5 minutes to find the first problem. The dealership, which owned 3 large commercial properties, had taken out not 1, not 2, but 3 separate mortgages. The most recent one was dated just a few weeks before Tiffany's last wedding. That date alone made me pause, but I kept going. I pulled up their sales reports for the past 5 years. The numbers were a disaster. Sales had dropped by over 40% in 3 years, which was catastrophic in the auto industry. But what was worse was that operating costs had gone up by more than 60%. That math made no sense, not unless someone was bleeding the company dry. I clicked deeper into the expenses, tracing each vendor line one by one. Then I found it a vendor listed as TCS Capital Partners. The company had been receiving quarterly payments for consulting services, except I had never heard of them and I had never seen them referenced in any legit business publication. I ran a state records check using my credentials, and what came up made me freeze. The business was registered under one name, Tiffany Chanel Styles. My sister, she was the sole owner. The C and S in TCS stood for Chad and Styles. I could not believe what I was seeing. This was not just reckless, this was criminal. I opened the ledger, sorted by vendor, filtered to show only payments to TCS, and stared at the screen in disbelief. 20 payments over 5 years, each one $100,000, listed as quarterly dividends and partner distributions. I cross-referenced the dates with the company's profit reports and saw that the dealership had reported a net loss for each of those quarters, meaning there was no profit, no reason for any distributions, especially not to a consulting company with no actual employees or services. The money was not being paid from profits, it was being paid with loans and debt. My father was taking out mortgages to funnel money to Tiffany through a fake company that is bank fraud. I whispered, but I was not done. Something about the cash flow still did not add up. The dealership's revenue was too low to support even these fake distributions. I went to the deposit records, and that was when I found it. 4 large deposits, each for $125,000, listed as benefit plan transfers. The dates were exactly 3 days before each of the TCS payments. Benefit plan, that meant the employee retirement fund. My stomach dropped. I opened the retirement fund portal and found a series of transfers from the company's 201k account to the general operations account. No loan agreements, no repayment terms, no Explanations: it was theft, pure and simple. My father had stolen over $1 million from the retirement fund to pay Tiffany's shell company. I felt sick. I knew the people whose names were on those retirement records: Mr. Henderson, who had worked as head mechanic for over 20 years, Sarah at the front desk, who had been there since before I graduated college. Their futures were being siphoned into Chanel purses and luxury. SUV Marcus had walked in while I was pulling the day. His face was quite serious. He had seen me like this before, and he knew I was not just his wife. Right now I was. Investigator, I told him what I found, every detail. He listened carefully, and when I was finished he nodded. This is not just a family betrayal. He said this is a federal crime. He sat beside me, placed his hand over mine, and said the most important words of the night: Kesha, stop being their daughter, be the accountant now. And suddenly I knew what I had to do. I sat still in my office chair for a long time after Marcus said those words: stop being his daughter, be the accountant, and I stared at the glowing screen in front of me, the weight of everything pressing down like a tidal wave. But my hands moved anyway. My fingers flew across the keyboard, opening more portals into the financial records that built the Harris family empire, or what was left of it, because now I could see it all with sharp, unclouded clarity. This wasn't just favoritism or dysfunction. This was a crime, a web of theft stitched together with false numbers, fake companies, and stolen futures. I dove into the operating accounts, pulled ledger after ledger. Every corner I turned revealed another red flag. I followed the pattern of distributions and deposits, tracing each one like a forensic map. And my stomach turned when I saw how methodical it had been, how careful they were to keep the illusion going. Each quarter the company's main operating account would receive a mysterious $125,000 deposit labeled benefit transfer, and 3 days later a clean, even $100,000 would be paid out to Tiffany's shell company, TCS Capital Partners, and it had been like that for 5 years. Not 1 or 2 slip-ups, but 20 perfect quarters of coordinated laundering. And I knew without question that my father had built the pipeline, and Chad had engineered the shell company, and Tiffany sat at the center, reaping the reward for doing nothing. I opened software I had helped my father install back when I still believed he cared about doing things right, and I accessed the payroll modules, the vendor payments, the internal transfers. And I found it buried under layers of misdirection and vague language. The retirement fund for Harris Motors, the 201k account, the one all the employees had trusted for decades, was drained and repurposed into a lifeline for my sister's lifestyle. I scrolled through the participant list, name after name after name, good people, decent people who showed up every day: Sarah, the receptionist; Henderson, mechanic; even old Harold, who ran the wash bay for over 15 years, and every one of them had been robbed, their savings repurposed to buy spa packages, ski trips, and luxury handbags. The rage in my chest was icy, controlled, but deep, because this wasn't about a personal betrayal anymore. It was about justice, and they had no idea that the quiet, boring daughter they ignored every holiday had all the tools and access to burn them to the ground. I clicked through more vendor files, traced more payments, opened up old corporate filings, and found even more proof. And then I dug into the tax documents, not just the corporate filings, but the personal ones too. I found inconsistencies in the numbers between what Tiffany and Chad were reporting and what TCS Capital was showing. I found underreported income on Chad's personal return and inflated consulting revenue on Tiffany's, and none of it made sense unless you were trying to wash stolen money into something clean, the kind of fraud you needed to keep your head above water in a world full of designer bags and private flights. And every line of it made me feel more certain this was what I was meant to do. This was what all the years of being overlooked had prepared me for. I could see every number, every lie, every manipulation, because they had trained me without knowing it. They made me quiet and dependable and pushed me to the background so they would never see me coming. I closed the tab and opened a new one, this time for state corporate filings. I searched for every variation of the company's name and found a small business registration in Delaware that wasn't on any of the main books. It was a single line item buried in a different account, a holding company set up as a parent to the Buck Head property. I cross-checked the address listed, and it matched the same address Chad had used to register one of his investment accounts. I opened the property records next and saw something that made my chest tighten. The Buckhead dealership location, the crown jewel of my father's chain, had been refinanced not once but twice, and both times the loans were structured in a way that transferred ownership interest to a corporate trustee, and the name on the trustee documentation was the same as the Delaware holding company, which meant that the flagship location was no longer even fully owned by Harris Motors. It was held in a shell, and that shell was partially controlled by Chad, which meant that my father had quietly and possibly unknowingly given Chad partial control over the entire business. I looked at Marcus, who had been standing behind me silent, watching me unravel everything, and I said, "They gave him the keys, Marcus. They gave him the business, and he's not even part of the family." Marcus sat down beside me, his voice flat. "He is not just managing the money, he is laundering it and protecting it and controlling it. He is not the son-in-law, he is the puppet master, and they let him do it because they needed the illusion to stay alive." He leaned forward and said, "You are not just looking at fraud, Kesha, you are looking at a conspiracy." I closed my laptop slowly and sat back, breathing hard, the realization washing over me. This was never about saving Tiffany, this was about survival for all of them. My parents were not silent because they were weak, they were silent because they were trapped, and Tiffany was not protected because they loved her. She was protected because she held the detonator, and if she ever stopped receiving her money, she would take them all down with her. Marcus looked at me and said quietly, "So what are we going to do?" And I said without hesitation, "We give them a choice, we give them a way out, or we bring the whole thing down tomorrow morning. I will prepare the paperwork, and we will walk into that office and give them one last chance, and if they refuse, I will take this to the SEC, the IRS, and the Department of Labor." And Marcus said, "Then you need to sleep, because tomorrow we are not visiting your parents, we are delivering justice." And I nodded, because for the first time in my life, I was no longer the daughter trying to be seen. I was the woman who saw everything. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I was already showered, dressed, and sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my printer humming beside me. There was no hesitation, no confusion, only clarity. Marcus moved silently in the background, brewing coffee, feeding Leo, changing diapers with a quiet calm that matched my own. We did not speak much because we did not need to. The plan had already been set by the time the messages stopped coming in from the family group chat. Sometime after midnight, we were no longer arguing or defending or reacting. We were strategizing. We were done playing by their rules. It was time they understood ours. Marcus placed a warm mug beside me and kissed the top of my head. I looked up at him and said, "We are going to walk in and change the whole conversation today." He nodded and said, "Yes, we are." And then I printed the final document, slid it into a black leather briefcase, and zipped it closed at exactly 9:59. We pulled into the parking lot of Harris Motors, the flagship Buckhead location, once a symbol of pride, now a building that looked more tired than iconic. The paint on the trim was chipping, the signage had not been updated in years, and the showroom windows were dusty, as if no one inside had bothered to care anymore. We stepped out of the car. Leo was with my cousin for the day, safe, warm, and loved. I carried the briefcase, and Marcus walked beside me in a tailored navy blue suit. His military bearings softened into the sleek form of lawyer ready for deposition. We stepped through the front doors and into the silence of a failing business. Sarah, the receptionist, looked up from behind the counter, her face weary but kind. She gave me a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Morning, Kesha, Mr. Harris is expecting you." I smiled back. "Thank you, Sarah." We walked past the sales floor, where only 2 cars were parked under dim lighting, and into the conference room, a glass box in the center of the building, the place my father always called the fishbowl. He used to hold meetings there like he was the king of a small kingdom, proud, powerful, untouchable. Now it felt like a stage with broken lights and tired actors inside the room. They were already waiting. My father sat at the head of the table, looking older than I had ever seen him. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to maintain his posture. My mother sat beside him, her expression blank, her fingers shredding the edges of a styrofoam cup into tiny flakes of white plastic. Tiffany sat across from her, legs, crossed arms, folded face, carved into a permanent sneer. She did not look up from her phone, and beside her was Chad, leaning back in his chair in an expensive jacket, scrolling through his watch settings, as if bored by the entire situation. Marcus opened the door for me. I walked in, set my briefcase on the table, and sat down. The room went quiet, the tension was heavy, and all four of them looked at me like they were expecting speech, a breakdown, a confession. Tiffany finally broke the silence with a smug chuckle. "See, I told you she would come crawling back. She said it without looking up from her phone. I told you give her a few days, and she would be begging for forgiveness." She set her phone down and locked eyes with me. "Go ahead." Kesha apologized. She gestured dramatically. "Let it all out. Tell us how sorry you are for ruining everything." My father cleared his throat, trying to sound authoritative. "Thank you for coming, Kesha," he said, as if he had invited me to a family brunch rather than an emergency meeting. "We are in a bit of a difficult moment financially. We need your help to fix this." His eyes flicked to Marcus. "And we believe you both are in a unique position to assist. You have stable incomes, good credit, clean reputations. You could co-sign a bridge loan for $500,000 to give us breathing room." His voice wavered at the number, but he pressed on. "If we can cover payroll and vendor fees for the next quarter, we can restructure and avoid liquidation." I did not speak. I did not nod. I simply opened my briefcase, clicked the metal clasps, and pulled out a document, a blue-bound folder thick with legal pages. I slid it across the table toward my father. "What is this?" he asked, his hand hesitating over the cover. "It is not a loan," I said. "It is a purchase agreement." My father blinked, confused. "Oh, what?" My mother stopped shredding her cup. Tiffany looked up, finally interested. Chad leaned forward. "A purchase agreement for what?" my father asked, his voice shaking. "For Harris Motors." I said. "The entire business, all assets and debts, for $1. Tiffany burst into laughter. "You cannot be serious," she said. "You are trying to buy Dad's legacy for $1. Are you having a breakdown, or are you just delusional?" My father was not laughing. He was reading the first page, and I watched the color drain from his face. The longer he read, the more his hands trembled. And then he slammed the folder shut and shouted, "$1? You insult me like this? You come into my business and offer me $1 for everything I built? You think you can embarrass me like this after everything I have done for you?" I looked at him, my voice calm. "This is not an insult. It is an escape plan. This company is worth less than nothing. The debts, the losses, the hidden loans. It is a crumbling house built on fraud. And I am offering you only way out." I leaned forward, my voice like steel. "I have seen the books, Dad. I know about the second and third mortgages on the Buck Head location. I know about the benefit fund transfers and the fake consulting company. I know you have been stealing from your employees' retirement accounts to fund Tiffany's lifestyle." My mother gasped. "No," I said. "I am not finished. I know about TCS Capital Partners. I know the payments labeled as dividends to a company that has never performed a service. I know you listed those payments during quarters with net losses, which means you lied to the bank. And I know about the shell company in Delaware, the one Chad used to move money through so he could clean it and send it back to Tiffany as profit." I leaned back and watched their faces fall, my father frozen, my mother now openly crying, Tiffany staring at Chad, who was suddenly pale and sweating. "Chad, say something." Tiffany snapped. "They are bluffing. They have nothing." "Right, Chad said nothing." Marcus stepped forward and placed a single white business card on the table. Chad glanced at it, and when he read the title, his face collapsed. The words "Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thorne, Judge, Advocate General's Corps" were printed in bold across the card. Chad looked like he might faint. Marcus said nothing for a moment, then spoke with the calm of a man used to making people nervous. "We know about the offshore accounts, Chad, the Global Strategic Fund in the Cayman Islands, the wire transfers, the unregistered securities, the laundering. I already spoke to the SEC and the IRS Criminal Division. They are very interested in this case. You are looking at 20 years in federal prison unless you cooperate right now." Chad did not argue. He did not speak. He simply sat back and stared at the table, his world collapsing in front of him. My father's shoulders sagged. He looked at me like a man defeated and whispered, "What do you want?" I stood up, placed the purchase agreement in front of him, and said, "I want you to sign, and I want you to do it now, or I walk out of here and send all of this to federal Enforcement, I will not hesitate. You chose a purse over your grand. Son, you chose silence over truth. Now you can choose prison or peace, and that is all you have left. The room stayed silent for a long time. No one moved, no one breathed, and then slowly, with shaking hands, my father reached for a pen, signed, and just like that, everything changed. The moment that signature hit the paper, something inside me cracked open, not from sadness or guilt, but from the sheer weight of knowing it was finally over. I stood there staring at the ink slowly drying on the page, while the world I grew up in collapsed behind me. My father kept his eyes on table, no longer the booming man who demanded respect from everyone who entered his world, now just a hollow man, slumped in a chair, surrounded by truths he had spent decades trying to bury. My mother had pulled out a tissue and was dabbing her eyes in slow, delicate circles, like she still could not believe her little girl had brought down the entire empire. Tiffany looked stunned, her face frozen like a broken statue, her lips parted like she wanted to scream, but the words would not come. And Chad, he was just staring at the glass wall, not blinking, not breathing, like he had seen the future, and it had crushed him where he sat. I gathered the papers, placed them gently back in the briefcase, then turned to Marcus and gave him a single nod, and without a word we walked out of the room, past the sales floor, past the quiet receptionist, who gave me the smallest respectful glance, and then through the heavy glass doors into the crisp morning air. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in what felt like years, it did not feel like I was drowning. The weight had lifted, and in its place there was only resolve. We got into the car, and Marcus took my hand. "You did it," he said softly. I squeezed his fingers and whispered, "We did it," but deep down I knew this was just the beginning, because taking control of the business was one thing, cleaning up the mess left behind was another entirely. We drove in silence to our attorney's office, where we handed over the documents and finalized the paperwork. Lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Regina, flipped through the pages with brisk efficiency, nodding approvingly at the signatures and legal clauses. "You timed this perfectly," she said, handing us a stack of official copies. "The moment this goes public, the narrative changes completely. Right now, the press still thinks you are the emotional one who stormed out of a holiday dinner." She looked up and smiled. "Now, you are the woman who rescued a sinking company from financial ruin and exposed fraud at the highest level. You are the one who did the right thing while everyone else looked away." I nodded, not out of pride, but because I needed to hear it, not for ego, but for clarity. We left the office and returned home, where Leo was napping peacefully in his crib, his tiny hands curled into fists, his face soft and safe. I stood by the side of the crib and just watched him for a while, letting the silence of that room settle over me, until Marcus came in and wrapped his arms around my waist. We stood there holding each other, not saying a word, because what else was there to say except that everything we had been through was worth it for this, for him, for peace. But peace was short-lived, because as the news began to break, everything erupted. I had sent the business filings and sale documents to 3 reporters from major outlets, and by that evening Harris Motors was trending across multiple platforms. The headlines were "Brutal Daughter Exposes Massive Fraud at Family Business, Granddaughter Seizes Dealership." In shocking legal move, former golden child under federal review for laundering. Social media was flooded with opinions, debates, videos, people choosing sides, and suddenly the world was watching our private family disaster unfold in real time. I expected some backlash, I expected outrage, but I was not prepared for the sheer volume of hate and venom that came pouring in, not from strangers but from extended family, from distant cousins, from old family friends, people I had not heard from in years, who now felt the need to weigh in with long emotional paragraphs about loyalty and betrayal, as if I had not been the one whose child was slapped, as if I had not been the one who was screamed at, ignored, and discarded, as if I had not spent years swallowing pain to keep this family from crumbling. The group chat was silent at first, then it exploded. One uncle accused me of destroying my father's legacy. Another aunt said I had humiliated my mother. Tiffany sent a single message full of insults, followed by a voice note where she called me every name she could think of before screaming that she would sue me for emotional distress. Chad sent nothing, which told me everything, and my mother, she sent me a picture of my father sitting on the porch alone, staring into the distance, with the caption, Is this what you wanted? I did not respond. I would not be baited into guilt or pity. Not again. Instead, I drafted a statement short and direct which I posted publicly. I love my family, but I will not protect abusers or enable corruption. I will always choose safety, truth, and justice, even when it costs me everything. And then I logged off and turned off my phone for the first time in days. I sat in silence, holding Leo in my arms and watching the snow fall outside the window. The quiet was loud, but it was mine, and it was honest. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Aunt Regina standing there, not my lawyer, but my dad's oldest sister, a woman I had not seen in over a year. She looked tired, older than I remembered, and when I invited her in, she walked straight to the living room, sat down, and let out a long sigh. I needed to see you, she said finally. I needed to say I am proud of you. She looked up, and her eyes were filled with tears. Your mother called me, told me everything, tried to make it sound like you were heartless, but I know better. She reached out and took my hand. You did what none of us had the strength to do. You ended it. She told me stories I had never heard about how my father had bullied employees, threatened vendors, manipulated relatives out of money, how my mother had stood by and kept the image pristine, even when things were rotting beneath the surface. We sat together for over an hour just talking, and by the end she stood, hugged me tightly, and whispered, "Protect that baby of yours with everything you have, because he is the only future that matters." And then she left quietly, leaving behind something I had not felt in years: validation. I was not crazy. I was not overreacting. I was not alone. And that night, as I tucked Leo into bed, I made a promise to him and to myself we would build a new tradition, one where holidays meant joy, not pain, where respect was mutual, not conditional, where truth was not punished and silence was not rewarded. It would not be easy, and there would still be scars, but they would not define us. They would not hold us back. And as I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, I felt something shift again, not loudly, not with fireworks, but like a door opening in a long dark hallway, finally letting in the light. The days after the outburst felt like walking through fog. Everything around me looked the same, but nothing felt normal. I would wake up in the morning, and for a few seconds everything seemed fine, until I remembered what had happened, and that heavy feeling would slam into my chest again like a weight I could not shake. I kept expecting someone in the family to call, maybe to apologize, or at least to check in on me and my son. But the phone stayed silent. My mother, who had once called me every other day, suddenly disappeared. My father did not even attempt to reach out, and Tiffany, of course, had vanished as if she had done nothing wrong. Marcus tried to stay positive. He kept reminding me that peace sometimes comes after storms, but I could see it in his eyes. He was angry too, not just for what happened, but for how alone we were left to deal with it. I spent most of my days going through motions, making bottles, folding laundry, playing with Leo, trying to keep his little world stable, even if mine was cracking underneath. I kept replaying the slap in my head, not because I wanted to relive it, but because I needed to understand how it had come to that moment. How could someone who shared my childhood, my secrets, my memories, look at my baby and see something worth hurting? I remembered when we were little, Tiffany would steal my favorite toys and hide them or lie to get me in trouble. But I always forgave her because she was my sister, and that word used to mean something. It used to mean loyalty, even when things were messy. It used to mean you do not cross certain lines. But at dinner, she crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. And no one did anything, no one stopped her, no one stood up for me. That silence from the people I trusted most was louder than the slap itself. Marcus and I sat down one night after putting Leo to bed, and he asked me the question I had been avoiding: do you want to cut them off? I did not answer right away because I was scared of what that answer would mean. I had always been the one who tried to hold the family together, even when it hurt, even when I was being ignored or used or guilt-tripped. I was the one who sent holiday cards, who made phone calls, who remembered birthdays, because deep down I thought if I just tried hard enough they would see me, they would love me the way I needed them to. But this time it was not about me anymore, it was about my child, and I could not let him grow up thinking this was normal. I finally nodded slowly and said, "Yes, I think I do." And the moment the words left my mouth, something inside me shifted, not in a dramatic way, but like a quiet door closing gently behind me. I started by blocking Tiffany, then my mother, then My father, I deleted the family group chat and removed myself from the holiday email list. I unsubscribed from the illusion that they cared more than they actually did. Marcus helped me write a short message to extended family, not dramatic, just clear, explaining that we would be taking space from family to prioritize our well-being, and that we hoped people would respect that. Most never responded. A few sent confused messages. One cousin asked if I was okay, but no one really fought for me. No one tried to make it right. It was like I had simply vanished, and they were fine with that. Around the same time, Marcus had an idea. He said we should make new holiday traditions just for us, a fresh start, something beautiful to replace the pain. He planned a quiet weekend trip for the three of us to a cozy cabin outside the city. We packed warm clothes, board games, favorite snacks, and hit the road with no expectations except to just breathe. The cabin was small, with creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that filled the room with warmth and orange light. Leo was mesmerized by the flickering flames, and for the first time in weeks I saw him really smile, the kind of belly laugh that fills a room and makes everything feel possible again. We spent our days taking walks in the snow, sipping cocoa under blankets, telling stories by the fire, and letting go of everything that had been weighing us down. It was not a perfect fix, but it was a beginning, a soft place to land when the world outside felt sharp. On the last night there, I wrote a letter to myself. I wrote about everything I had been through, not just the dinner, but the years of feeling less than, of trying to earn love from people who only gave it conditionally. I wrote about my sister and the way she had always needed to be on top, even if it meant pushing others down. I wrote about my parents and how their silence had been louder than any words. I wrote about the way I felt when I held Leo and knew I had the chance to break the cycle. And I ended the letter with a promise to never let anyone make me feel small again. We came back home feeling lighter, like we had finally let go of a burden that was never ours to carry. I framed the letter and hung it in our hallway as a reminder that choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. Life slowly began to find a new rhythm. Leo turned 1, and we celebrated with a simple gathering. Just us and a few close friends, people who actually showed up for us, who asked how we were and listened when we answered. I looked around the room at the smiles and laughter and realized I did not miss the people who had once filled these spaces. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. It was from my mother, handwritten, pages and pages of excuses, half apologies, twisted memories, and guilt-laced sentences, the kind that sounded sweet on the surface but cut deep when you read between the lines. She said things like, I did not know how to react, or I never thought Tiffany meant it like that, and you should not have made a scene on Christmas. And it ended with, I hope you come to your senses before it is too late. I read it once, then I read it again, and each time it felt like she was saying the same thing I have always said. This is who we are, take it or leave it. So I left it. I folded the letter and put it in a box at the back of the closet, where I kept other pieces of the past that no longer served me, and I walked into the living room where Leo was building blocks with Marcus, and I sat beside them and said this right here. This is my family now, not the people who share my blood, but the ones who share my heart. And I meant every word, because family is not about obligation. It is about choice, and I was finally choosing me. It was strange how healing did not always feel like joy. Sometimes it felt like sadness, sometimes like numbness, and sometimes it was just quiet, like a song playing far away, barely reaching your ears, but always there, reminding you that you were not stuck anymore. I had started to rebuild a version of life that felt safer, more honest, and slowly I could see who I was becoming, not the person who flinched at every harsh word or stayed silent to keep peace, but a mother who stood firm, a woman who trusted her instincts more than anyone else's opinions. Still, there were days when the past would sneak up on me, especially in moments I did not expect. Like one morning I was making pancakes for Leo, and I suddenly remembered how my mother used to burn them every Christmas morning. But we would eat them anyway because it was tradition, and I missed the idea of family sitting together laughing even when the food was bad. But then the memory twisted, and I saw her face from that night at the Christmas table, the way she looked through me, not at me, and it turned my stomach. The ache came back, but I let it pass like a wave. I did not run from it. I just waited for it to leave, because I had Learned it always did. Marcus had been patient through all of it. His calm was like an anchor, and even though he had not lived my pain, he never once made me feel like I had to explain every detail. He just listened, held my hand, and reminded me that the life we were building mattered more than the one I walked away from. We had begun talking about moving, not out of fear, but for a fresh start, something that felt like our own, maybe a new town, a slower pace, more trees, less traffic, fewer ghosts, and more space for Leo to grow up without the weight of family expectations that I had carried for too long. We looked at houses online during late nights when Leo had fallen asleep, and I would dream about a garden with a swing, a kitchen filled with music on Sunday mornings, and a front porch where we could drink coffee and watch the sun rise. It was not about escaping, it was about choosing something new on our own terms. One afternoon, while sorting through mail, I found a letter without a return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from my father. My heart thudded as I opened it carefully, not knowing what I wanted it to say. Inside was a short note, nothing emotional, nothing deep, just a few lines saying he hoped I was well, that he missed Leo, and that maybe one day we could sit down and talk. My hands trembled as I read it, not from anger, but from disbelief. After everything that happened, that was all he wrote. No apology, no acknowledgement, no sense of understanding. It was like he was inviting me to forget without doing any of the work, and I could not accept that. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, not ready to reply, not ready to give him access to our peace again, because reaching out without change is not healing, it is manipulation. I was not going to fall for that anymore. Leo was starting to walk now, and watching him take wobbly steps across the floor made something bloom in my chest every time, like hope, like proof that we were moving forward even when it felt slow. He would stumble, laugh, and get back up, and it reminded me that falling was not the problem. Staying down was, and I was not staying down. I was rising every day with more strength than the last. I had started seeing a therapist, too, someone who helped me untangle the guilt that still lingered like smoke. She reminded me that anger is not a bad emotion. It is a compass pointing you toward something that needs to change. And grief, she said, is not Lynn. Ere it loops, it lingers, and it surprises you when you think you are fine. She helped me understand that I could love parts of my past while still refusing to return to it. I could miss who I thought my mother was and still protect myself from who she had shown herself to be, and that gave me peace, not complete peace, but enough to breathe better, to sleep deeper. One night, after a particularly long day, Leo had cried through most of it, teething and restless. I finally got him to sleep, and as I sat there in the quiet dark, I felt loneliness creep in, not because I was alone, but because there was still a small part of me that wished things had been different. I wished my sister had not been so cruel. I wished my mother had stood up for me. I wished my father had not watched me walk away without chasing after me. But wishes do not rewrite reality, and reality was what I had to live with. I reminded myself that my wishes were rooted in a version of the past that never existed, and letting go of that illusion was part of the healing. A few days later, I got a call from an unknown number, and when I answered, it was my cousin Eliza. She said she had heard what happened at Christmas and that she had wanted to call earlier, but did not know what to say. I told her it was okay, and we talked for almost an hour about childhood memories, family tension, and how many things had been swept under the rug over the years. She admitted that she had always seen how differently my parents treated Tiffany, but never knew how to bring it up, and now, looking back, she wished she had. I thanked her for her honesty, because even though it did not fix anything, it felt good to be seen. We agreed to meet for coffee, and it turned out to be one of the best conversations I had in months. Sometimes validation comes from unexpected places, and it reminded me that not everyone in my extended family was blind to the truth. As spring began to bloom, I felt lighter, like the earth itself was waking up, and I was waking up with it. I planted flowers on our balcony, even though we were still in the apartment, just to feel something grow, something colorful, something alive, and Leo loved them. He would point at the blossoms with wide eyes and say, "Wow," and every time I saw that wonder on his face, I knew I had made the right choice, no matter how painful the path had been. I was building a better story for him, one that started with breaking old patterns, not repeating them. I had not spoken to Tiffany since that night, and I did not plan to, not because I hated her, but because I no longer needed her presence to validate my worth. I used to think closure meant one last conversation, one final explanation, but now I knew that sometimes closure is choosing silence, protecting your peace, and walking away without turning back, because not every story deserves a sequel. Some chapters must end so that others can begin, and I was ready for what came next. As spring faded into summer and the days grew longer and brighter, I felt something in me growing clearer like fog lifting from a field, not all at once, but slowly enough to see where I was going even if the entire path was not visible. Yet Leo was thriving. He was laughing more, babbling new words every week, and his energy filled our apartment with life. He would run to the balcony every morning, pointing to the sky and shouting bird or sun or flower. And each time he did, I felt this ache in my chest, a bittersweet ache, because I remembered how I once wished he could grow up surrounded by cousins, uncles, grandparents, a family that cheered his little milestones. But now I realized he did not need a big, noisy crowd to feel loved. He needed presence, he needed peace, he needed truth. And I was giving him all of that. Marcus continued being the quiet strength in our home. He never pushed me to reconnect with anyone. He never doubted the choices I made for our family. Instead, he built around them, like a man building a fortress brick by brick, never complaining, just steady and sure. And because of that, I started to feel less afraid of what came next. We started seriously looking at houses now. No longer just dreaming, and one Sunday morning we drove out to a nearby town not too far from the city, but quiet enough to feel like a different world. Tree-lined streets, wide open parks, neighbors who smiled as you passed them. We saw a house with blue shutters and a wraparound porch, and I felt my heart jump like it recognized something before my mind could catch up. I walked through the room's sunlight pouring across wooden floors, and I saw Leo playing with blocks by the fireplace. I saw us cooking dinner with music playing. I saw birthdays and school mornings and rainy afternoons with books and hot cocoa. I saw us here, really here, and when Marcus asked what I thought, I could only nod, tears burning my eyes, because I knew this was ours. We made an offer that week, and when it was accepted, I felt like I had closed the last door on my old life, not out of bitterness, but because a new door had opened wide and bright and inviting. We moved in by the end of the month, and though the boxes were still half unpacked, it already felt like home. Leo adjusted quickly. He loved his new room, his small garden, his swing on the porch, and every night he would fall asleep faster than before, his little body sinking into the comfort of this new beginning. I started sleeping better too, deeper, quieter, like my body had finally decided it was safe to rest. One evening, I found a box I had forgotten to unpack. It was filled with old photos, cards, notes from the past, and for a moment I hesitated, unsure if I even wanted to open it. But then I did, not out of longing, but out of closure. I sifted through pictures of birthday parties, beach trips, school plays, all those moments frozen in time, and I realized something. Those memories were real. They were not all lies or illusions, but they were fragments, and fragments do not make the whole truth. They are just pieces, and I was done trying to stitch them into something they were not. I kept a few photos for Leo, one of me and Tiffany as kids smiling on a swing, one of my mother holding me as a baby, and one of all of us at a barbecue laughing with mustard on our shirts, because I wanted him to know where he came from without carrying the weight of it. I tucked them into a small album labeled Roots and placed it on the top shelf of our bookcase, not hidden, just distant from daily reach. Summer rolled on, and our days were filled with walks, ice cream, sidewalk chalk, and chasing butterflies. Leo made a friend across the street, a little boy named Jonah, and watching them play together reminded me of what childhood should feel like, easy, free, full of light and laughter. Sometimes the past would try to creep back, like when I saw a card in the mail from my aunt, or a notification on my phone from an old group chat that I never left but no longer checked, and each time I felt the pull, I asked myself, does this bring me peace or pain? And if the answer was pain, I let it go without guilt, without explanation, just release, because healing is not only about who you become, but also what you choose to no longer carry. One afternoon, while Leo napped and Marcus worked on the porch, I sat with my journal and wrote something I had never said out loud. I forgive you, not because you asked, not because you deserved it, but because I deserve to be free. I wrote it over and over. I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you, until the words stopped feeling like surrender and started feeling like power. And in that moment I felt a shift, not a loud one, not a lightning strike, but a quiet settling like dust after a storm. I was no longer haunted by what they did, I was just done being tethered to it. I shared those words with no one, not even Marcus, because they were mine, just mine, and that made them sacred. In early autumn, we threw a small gathering in our backyard, just a few neighbors, Leo's new friend, and his parents. Simple food, soft music, laughter that came easily and stayed long after the sun set. And as I watched Leo run barefoot in the grass holding a slice of watermelon, his face sticky with joy, I felt something bloom in me, a kind of pride I had never known. I had protected him. I had chosen the hard path, the lonely path, the silent path, and now it had led it here to this moment where joy was loud and love was steady and family was something we were creating, not something we escaped. And as the sky turned golden, I whispered a thank you to the universe, to the version of me who did not give up, and to the life that waited patiently while I found the courage to live it. Winter returned, but this year it felt different. Instead of reminding me of everything that went wrong, the cold air carried a kind of clarity, like it had swept through my soul and cleaned out the leftover debris from the year before. The Christmas lights that once made my stomach twist with memory now simply looked beautiful, glowing softly from porches and windows, as if the world itself was trying to comfort me. Marcus brought home a tree, a real one, this time full and fragrant, and he and Leo spent an entire afternoon hanging ornaments and stringing popcorn and giggling every time something fell or tangled. I stood back watching them, my hands wrapped around a warm mug, and I felt something so rare and quiet. It took me a moment to name it. It was peace, not a loud victory, not a dramatic triumph, just a quiet, real peace, the kind that sits in your bones and tells you you are safe now. That evening, after Leo went to bed, Marcus lit a few candles and pulled out a small wrapped box from his coat pocket. I looked at him, confused. It was not Christmas yet, and we had agreed no gifts this year, just moments, just time. But he smiled and said, "This is not for Christmas, this is for every day you chose yourself when no one else did." I opened it slowly, and inside was a delicate silver locket with a tiny engraving on the back. It read, "Brave Heart." I could not speak for a second because the lump in my throat was too big to swallow, and when I finally looked up at him, he said, "I saw you carry so much alone and still choose love. Every time I want you to wear this when you forget what you survived." I wore that necklace every day after that, not for style, but as armor, and sometimes when I felt doubt creeping back in, I would touch it and remember how far I had come. I started writing again, not just in my journal, but actual essays about motherhood, boundaries, healing, and truth. I did not plan to share them at first. They were just for me. But one day Marcus read one and said this could help someone, and that thought stuck with me. I started a small blog, anonymous at first, writing about the journey, not in dramatic ways, but in honest, raw pieces that said it is okay to walk away even from blood. It is okay to protect your child even if no one else claps for it. It is okay to be the one who breaks the cycle. And to my surprise, people started reading. Women from all over who felt invisible, silenced, or shamed started commenting, thanking me for saying the things they were too afraid to say. And in those moments I did not feel alone anymore. I felt part of something bigger, a quiet army of mothers who were rewriting what family meant. Leo turned 4 that winter, and we threw a small party with just a few friends, some cupcakes, balloons, and a lot of laughter. I watched him blow out his candles, eyes shining, and I thought about how just a year ago this same child had been slapped in a room full of silence, and how now he was surrounded by joy, sound, color, truth. I felt proud not just of him, but of myself for choosing this path, for walking it even when it was steep and lonely, and for never looking back. A few weeks later, I got a message from my father. It was short, a few lines, just saying he hoped I was well, and that he missed Leo. I stared at it for a long time, not with anger or hurt, but with stillness. I did not reply, not because I was punishing him, but because I no longer needed the words he had not said all these years to suddenly mean something. I was done chasing closure from people who never offered it when it mattered most, and that decision felt like another kind of freedom. Not the loud kind, but the kind that opens a window and lets the light in. I continued therapy, and one day my therapist said something that stayed with me. She said, "Forgiveness is not about saying what happened was okay, it is about saying, I am not going to carry this anymore." I thought about that often. and realized I had already started forgiving not directly, but the version of myself that stayed too long, waited too much, gave too freely. I forgave her for not knowing better, for hoping too hard, for wanting love to come from where it never would. And as I did, I felt myself grow lighter, as if all this time I had been dragging chains I did not know where their spring came again, and with it a sense of rhythm, a life that no longer felt like recovery, but like living. We planted a small garden in the backyard, tomatoes, basil, sunflowers, and Leo loved digging in the dirt with his tiny shovel, saying he was making food for the bees. We adopted a rescue dog, a gentle golden mix Leo named Sunny, and she fit right in, curling at our feet during movie nights and running circles around the yard like she had always belonged. And one afternoon, as I watched Marcus carry Leo on his shoulders, both of them laughing in the golden sunlight, I realized this is the life I used to dream of back when I felt trapped, unseen, unheard. This was the dream I fought for, and it was real, not perfect, not without challenges, but real and mine and whole. And as I stood there, locket warm against my skin, I whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the world, for giving me another chance to get it right. That summer marked a strange turning point, not because anything massive happened, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, life moved without the shadow of their judgment. I had built something solid around Leo and me. A small circle of trust, a house that no longer carried echoes of old wounds, and a routine that gave us peace. In the mornings we would make pancakes or eggs depending on Leo's mood. He had become obsessed with cracking the eggs himself, and I always let him, even when it meant more shells than usual. By the time he was dressed and off to preschool, I had a few hours to myself. Sometimes I used it to write, sometimes to clean, and sometimes I just sat in the quiet, breathing deeply, like I was still reminding my body that the storm had passed. Every now and then I would see a picture of my sister pop up on mutual friends' pages, or hear a story through the grapevine about another family gathering I had not been invited to, and each time it stung a little less, each time it felt more like watching a show I had once been in, but no longer had a role in. Marcus had become more than a partner. He was my rock. He never rushed my healing, never asked me to let things go before I was ready. He just showed up again and again, steady and kind and patient. And that patience taught me something I had never learned growing up, that love does not have to be loud or dramatic or wrapped in guilt. Sometimes it just shows up quietly and holds your hand when you are too tired. Hold your own. Leo started asking more questions around that time. He was getting older, curious and observant, and one day he asked, "Why do we not go to Grandma's house?" I froze for a second, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to get it right. I knelt down, looked him in the eyes, and said, "Because sometimes people, even people we love, do things that are not safe, and it is my job to keep you safe." He seemed to take that in, nodding slowly, and then asked if we could make cookies. I smiled and said, "Of course," and that was the end of it for now. But I knew more questions would come as he grew, and I promised myself I would always meet them with honesty, not bitterness, just truth. It was during one of our Saturday park days that I bumped into Jasmine. She was with her daughter, who was a few years older than Leo, and as our kids ran toward the swings, she walked over, hesitant, eyes wide, like she was not sure if she should speak. I stayed still, waiting to see what she would do, and finally she said, "I miss you." I nodded because I did not know what else to say, and she added, "I know I did not stand up for you, and I hate that I let you go through that alone." I swallowed hard, not because I was angry, but because I had carried her silence like a wound for so long, and now hearing her voice, it felt like something old finally loosened. I told her I appreciated the words, and she asked if we could maybe meet sometime for coffee or just a walk. No pressure, just a chance to talk. I said maybe not now, but someday, and she smiled, like even that small opening meant something. Later that night I told Marcus about it, and he just said, "I am proud of you no matter what you choose, whether you let her back in or not. I just want you to feel free." And that was the thing. I did feel free, not just from the people who hurt me, but from the version of myself who thought I had to keep everyone happy to deserve love. One afternoon, while Leo was napping, I sat down and reread the letter my mother had sent all those months ago. I had not touched it since I shoved it in the drawer that day. It was short, stiff and full of half-hearted lines about missing us and hoping I was well, but there was no mention of what had happened, no apology, no ownership. It was like she had written it just to ease her own guilt, and as I read it again, I realized I felt nothing, not anger, not sadness, just nothing, and that was its own kind of closure. It told me everything I needed to know. She had not changed, she had not even tried, and I was not going to beg her to. I threw the letter away this time, not out of rage, but out of clarity, and it felt like taking out the trash of an old life that no longer fit. I started speaking at small community groups, sharing parts of my story, not the dramatic parts, not the slap or the silence, but the parts about boundaries, about trusting your gut, about walking away even when it feels like failure. And each time I stood up and told the truth, a little more of my shame cracked and fell away, and the women who came up to me after, who whispered thank you like I had said the thing they could not say, those were the moments that reminded me why I had chosen the harder path. This story was not just mine anymore, it was a mirror for others too. As fall rolled in, I found myself decorating our home with Leo, carving pumpkins, baking bread, lighting candles. I was building new traditions, not in reaction to what had been lost, but in celebration of what we had created. Marcus surprised me with a weekend trip, just the three of us, to a cabin in the woods. It was quiet and cozy, and we spent our days hiking, making s'mores, and watching movies snuggled under blank. It's one night as Leo slept, Marcus took my hand and said, "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if you had stayed, if you had not spoken up?" And I did think about it sometimes, not often, but enough to remember how small I used to feel, how hard I used to work to be good enough, how I twisted myself into someone they could accept, and how none of it ever worked. And I looked at him and said I would not trade this for anything, not even a fake peace with them. And he kissed my forehead and whispered me neither. And in that stillness, with the fire crackling and the wind outside whispering through the trees, I felt whole, not perfect, not healed, but whole, and that was enough. Winter came around again, and with it the buzz of holiday lights lining the streets and store windows, flashing with offers and fake snow, and everything that once made me feel like home, but now reminded me of the deep ache I used to carry during this time. It was strange to live in peace while the world celebrated with noise. There were no invitations this year from my family, none of those forced cheerful group texts, no reminders of gatherings or dinner times, and while a part of me thought I might miss it, the truth was I felt relief, pure and heavy and real. Marcus and I decided to keep it small, just us and Leo, with maybe a visit to one of his cousins on Marcus' side, people who never made us feel less than, never made us beg for room at the table. Leo was old enough now to understand Christmas, and he had written a list for Santa that included a red fire truck, a puppy, and chocolate pancakes every morning. I knew we could not get him a puppy, not yet, but I smiled when I read it because it meant he was dreaming again, safe enough to imagine and believe. Christmas morning, we woke up to snow, real snow, thick and soft, falling slowly like a gift from the sky. Marcus made coffee while I set out the gifts, and Leo burst into the room in his little pajamas yelling, "Santa came, Santa came," and I laughed because his joy felt like a healing spell. We opened presents, played music, danced in the kitchen, and by noon we were all bundled up, heading to Marcus' sister's house for lunch. When we arrived, they welcomed us with hugs and warmth, no tension, no second guessing, no walking on eggshells, just real family, not by blood, but by love. And over the table filled with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, pies, and laughter, I realized this was what I had always wanted, a space where no one had prove their worth, a space where no one had to worry about a slap or a silent stare or being told they were too much or not enough. Later that afternoon, while the kids played in the yard, I stepped outside for air, snow still falling slowly, and looked up at the sky, breathing it all in. It hit me that how far I had come from that night last Christmas when my world cracked from the silence in that room, from the moment I chose to walk away from the weight of pretending, from the years of swallowing my pain just to keep peace that never existed. And now here I was standing in the cold, but wrapped in warmth, not because life was perfect, but because I had finally chosen something better. Leo ran up to me, then holding a snowball and shouting, "Mommy, look," and I laughed, grabbing my own snow. And before long we were in a full snow fight, our cheeks red, our hands cold, but our hearts light when we got home. That evening I tucked Leo in, kissed his forehead, and sat beside him, watching his slow breathing, his tiny hands clutching a new teddy bear. He named courage, and I thought of all the mothers out there who were still sitting at those tables, still being silenced, still being told they were overreacting. And I whispered into the quiet, I see you and you deserve more. I opened my journal that night and began writing, not for anyone else, but for me. I wrote down everything I had held back, every memory, every moment I had minimized, every scream I had swallowed. And as I wrote, I cried not because I was sad, but because I was finally telling the truth, the full truth, without editing, without shrinking. And when I finished, I felt lighter, like I had finally honored the girl. I used to be the one who took it, the one who stayed, the one who tried to keep it all together when everything was falling apart. Days turned into weeks, and the new year arrived quietly. Marcus took me to a cabin in the mountains, just the two of us for a weekend getaway. No phones, no noise, just fire, wood, snow, and the sound of wind through the trees. One night, as we sat by the fire wrapped in a blanket, he looked at me and said, "You are not the same woman I met," and I smiled because he was right. I was no longer trying to fit into spaces that were too small for me. I was no longer dimming myself to survive. I had grown taller, not in height, but in spirit. And when I looked at him, I said, "I finally feel like myself." And he kissed me with the kind of love that does not ask you to change, the kind that meets you exactly where you are, the kind that stays when it gets hard. We talked late into the night about everything and nothing, about dreams, about Leo, about the future. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine that future without fear, not because I had it all figured out, but because I knew I had survived the worst, and that gave me courage to build something better, one block at a time. When we returned home, I framed a photo from that trip, a simple shot of me standing in the snow, smiling, no makeup, no filters, just me. And I hung it by the front door, a reminder every time I stepped out that I had already walked through fire and come out stronger. The story was not over. There would be more challenges, more questions, more days where grief would rise without warning. But I was ready, not because I had all the answers, but because I had found my voice, and I was never going to let it be silenced again. And that was the beginning of everything. The following weeks brought an unexpected calm, a silence that was not heavy or uncomfortable, but one that let me breathe freely without walking on eggshells. I did not hear from my parents, not a single call or message, no apology, no awkward explanation, nothing from them or from my sister. And honestly, I did not expect one anymore. What once would have crushed me now made me feel stronger, because I knew I was no longer chasing their approval or begging for space in their hearts. They had made their choice, and now so had I. Marcus noticed the change in me and told me one evening while we were folding laundry that I seemed lighter, freer, like I had dropped a weight I had been dragging for years. I told him I had, and it was made of years of guilt, silence, and trying to be the bigger person. Even when I was hurting now, I was focused on healing, on giving Leo a life where love was never conditional or silent. When things got hard one afternoon, I took Leo to the park. It was cold, but the sky was clear, and he ran around laughing, chasing birds, and throwing leaves in the air. And I sat on the bench watching him, and realized how peaceful life felt without the storm of family drama constantly circling over me. I thought of that Christmas night again, and not with the same burn of anger, but with clarity, like a scar that no longer hurt but still reminded me of where I had been. Leo came back to me that day with a stick in his hand, and said he wanted to build a house for his teddy bear in the sandbox, and I helped him pat down the walls and shape a little door, and I smiled because that was the kind of home I wanted to build, one where imagination and kindness lived side by side. No slaps, no silence, just safety. We went home, and he asked if we could bake cookies, and while he measured the sugar and spilled flour all over the counter, I realized this was the life I wanted, not picture perfect, but honest, warm, real. We danced in the kitchen, waiting for the cookies to bake, and I remembered my own childhood, the quiet ones, the empty apologies, the cold looks across holiday tables. And I promised myself I would never let Leo feel like that, never let him grow up thinking love came with punishment or silence. As days passed, I began reconnecting with parts of myself I had lost. I started painting again, nothing fancy, just colors and strokes on a canvas, and every brush felt like Another piece of me returning home, Marcus encouraged it, even set up a little space in the guest room for me with all my paints and canvases, and every time I stepped into that space I felt like I was finally allowing joy back, in not because life was perfect, but because I had stopped shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. One night, while Marcus and Leo were asleep, I got a message on my phone. It was from my aunt, one of the few in my family, who had always been kind though distant. She wrote that she had heard what happened at Christmas, and that she was sorry she had not reached out sooner. She wanted me to know she supported me, and believed I had done the right thing. She said that she had seen things for years, things she had brushed off or stayed silent about, but she was proud I had stood up for myself. And for Leo, reading her message made my hands shake, because for once someone from my own bloodline acknowledged what had been ignored for so long. I wrote back thanking her and saying her words meant more than she knew, and that maybe someday we could meet for coffee and talk, not as a niece and aunt, but as two women trying to break the patterns we were born into. She replied instantly, saying she would love that, and it made me feel less alone, like maybe I was not the only one trying to heal beyond the boundaries of a broken family. I began writing more too, not just in my journal, but stories, little essays about motherhood and boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to walk away from those who refuse to grow. I posted one anonymously online and was surprised when it got shared hundreds of times, and people commented saying they felt seen, understood, that they had lived the same silence, the same blame, the same hurt. It reminded me that there were so many of us carrying wounds hidden beneath smiles, and that maybe, just maybe, my story could help someone feel less alone. Marcus found me crying over my laptop one night, not from sadness, but from release, and he wrapped his arms around me and said, "You are helping people." And I whispered, "I am helping myself too." And he kissed my forehead, saying that was the most important part. Leo continued to grow into the kindest little boy, full of questions and laughter, and sometimes I would watch him sleep and think how lucky I was to have him, how grateful I was to have walked away from that toxic dinner table into a life where he could thrive. One evening, he asked why we did not go to Grandma's house anymore, and I sat down beside him and said, sometimes people, even family, can hurt us without saying sorry. And until they do, we have to protect our hearts. He looked at me and nodded in his small, wise way and said, like superheroes protect the city. And I smiled and said exactly just like that. I knew then he understood more than I thought, and that gave me hope that he would grow up to choose kindness and strength, not silence and fear. As spring came, we planned a small vacation to the coast, just the three of us, and standing by the ocean with the wind in my hair and Leo's laughter in the air, I felt whole. I looked at Marcus and said, "Thank you for staying through it all." And he replied, "Thank you for fighting through it all." And I knew then that we were not just surviving, we were building something new and beautiful from the ashes of what broke us. Summer arrived quietly, bringing warm days filled with long walks, ice cream stops, and lazy afternoons on the porch. And with every passing week, the silence from my family continued, and with every day I did not hear from them, I felt more sure that I had made the right decision. I was not angry anymore, not burning with the same fury that had once made my hands shake, but I was clear I was no longer available for people who could watch a child be slapped and say nothing. I was no longer available for people who could hurt and pretend they had not. I started volunteering at a community center nearby, where I worked with mothers who had experienced emotional or physical abuse, and as I listened to their stories, I realized how many of us had learned to normalize pain just to keep the peace. I would help them fill out paperwork, find housing, or even just sit with them and listen while they cried. And in doing that, I found parts of my voice again, parts that had been silenced in years of trying to be the good daughter, the good sister, the good girl. One of the women I met was named Serena. She had 2 kids and a story that could have been mine in another life. She told me how she left her family, not just her partner, but her entire family, when they kept asking her to forgive him, when they kept inviting him to dinners, telling her to stop making things difficult. And hearing her speak made me realize I was not alone in what I had done. I was not cruel. I was not cold. I was just someone who had finally said no. One day, Serena looked at me and said, "Your peace is the loudest protest." And I carried those words with me like a shield that night. I sat outside with Marcus and told him everything about Serena, about the center, about how healing sometimes felt like learning to walk all over again, and he held my hand and said, "Whatever you need to keep walking, I will be beside you," and I believed him, because he had proven it over and over again. One evening, I received a package with no return label. When I opened it, I found a small photo album inside filled with pictures from my childhood, old birthdays, school plays, family trips, and I recognized my mother's handwriting on the last page. It said, "I hope you remember the good too." I closed the book and held it in my hands for a long time, and I did remember the good, the summer trips, the bedtime stories, the way my dad used to lift me up and spin me around when I was small, but I also remembered the silence, the shame, the way they watched my sister slap my son and said nothing. I placed the album on the shelf not out of anger, but because I was not ready to pretend those pictures told the full story. They were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that did not show the full truth. Leo was growing taller each day, his curiosity endless, and I found myself answering questions I never thought I would have to, like, why do some people pretend to be nice but are not, or why do some families not talk anymore? And every time I gave him the truth, simple but clear, because I never wanted him to live in confusion the way I had for so long. In August, Marcus surprised me with a weekend away, just the two of us, while Leo stayed with his favorite babysitter. We drove to a quiet cabin by the lake. No phone signal, no distractions, just us. We talked about everything. Our childhoods, our future, what kind of people we wanted to be, not just for Leo, but for ourselves. And I realized I was learning to dream again, not just survive, not just cope, but truly dream. I talked about maybe going back to school, getting a degree in social work or family counseling, and Marcus said, "Do it, we will figure it out." And for the first time in years, the idea of building something new felt exciting, not terrifying. When we returned home, Leo ran into our arms with stories of everything he had done, and I held him tight, thinking of how much he had grown, not just in size, but in spirit. I was raising a boy who knew how to speak up, how to love, how to stay soft in a world that had tried to harden him. One day in early September, my sister called for the first time since Christmas. I saw her name flash on my screen, and my stomach twisted. I let it ring out. I was not ready, not yet, not like that. She left a voicemail saying she missed me, missed Leo, and that she had been thinking about what happened. She said she was sorry for everything, for the slap, for not saying it sooner, for letting pride keep her silent. She sounded different, quieter, maybe even sincere, but I did not call back right away. I sat with it for days, replaying her words, trying to figure out what I felt. There was no triumph in her apology, no satisfaction, just a quiet ache, because it came too late. And even though I appreciated it, I was not sure it changed anything. One night I told Marcus about it, and he said, "You can accept her apology without letting her back in," and those words gave me peace. I wrote my sister a letter, not long, not cold, just honest. I said I heard her, I forgave her, but I was protecting Leo and myself, and that meant distance, not punishment, just space. She never replied, and I did not expect her to, and that was okay. I continued working at the center, continued writing, continued building a life that felt like mine, fully, truly mine. Leo started kindergarten that fall, and on his first day I cried in the parking lot, not just because my baby was growing up, but because he was stepping into a world I had prepared him for, with truth, with love, with boundaries. I watched him walk through those school doors, confident and smiling, and I knew I had done something right. I had broken a cycle. I had chosen something better for him and for myself. The final leaves of autumn fell slowly as the wind picked them up one by one, spinning them in circles before they landed softly on the ground, and life kept moving forward with or without the closure I had once thought I needed. I was no longer checking my phone, hoping for messages from my family. I had stopped replaying the Christmas dinner over and over again, trying to change the outcome in my mind, and I had finally made peace with the fact that some people would never understand the damage they caused, or worse, they would understand and still choose to ignore it. I had built something strong and quiet around myself, something no one else could shake, because it was not built on their approval anymore. I had found strength in my silence, not the kind of silence that hides truth, but the kind that waits for the storm to pass so it can speak clearly. I had learned to breathe deeply even when Memories threatened to choke me, and I had found new joys that replaced old griefs. Leo was thriving in school, making friends, reading books, laughing loudly in ways I never could as a child, and Marcus and I had started talking about buying a house of our own, something small, something ours it would be. The kind of place where peace lived in the walls, where Leo would never have to flinch or apologize for needing protection. It would be a home, not just a house. One evening in late October, I received a letter in the mail from my father. It was handwritten on lined paper, folded neatly with no return address, just his name written at the bottom. He said he was sorry. He said he had been too afraid to speak up, and then too ashamed that he had not said anything sooner. He wrote about Christmas, how he knew he should have stopped my sister, how he hated himself for sitting there and pretending everything was okay. He said he missed me, missed Leo, and that he was trying to be better, that he had started therapy, that he wanted to learn how to stand up and not just sit silently like he always had. I read the letter 3 times, then set it down and cried, not because I forgave him instantly, but because those words had been missing for so long, and now they were here, late but honest. I showed Marcus the letter, and he said, "Take your time with it. There is no rush to forgive if you are not ready," and I loved him for that, for giving me room to feel without rushing the end of the story. A week later, I wrote my father back a short note saying, "Thank you for your honesty." I said I was not ready to rebuild, but I appreciated his words, and that was the truth. I did not write for him. I wrote for myself, because I had learned that saying what you feel is a gift you give yourself, not just others, and it felt like something had cracked open in my chest. Something warm, something soft. I started journaling more, writing down everything I had been afraid to say for years, the betrayals, the moments of joy, the doubts, the wins, the losses, all of it. And in that process, I began to recognize my own voice. Again, the one I had buried under years of silence and obedience. By November, the air had turned cold and crisp, and we took Leo to see the holiday lights in town. As he ran through the displays, pointing at every reindeer and snowflake, I watched him and thought, this is what healing looks like. It looked like watching your child live in a world you made safer. It looks like knowing you chose something better, even when it hurt. In the distance, a car passed, and for a moment I thought I saw my sister in the passenger seat, head turned away, hair tucked behind one ear, and I felt nothing, not anger, not sadness, just stillness, and I took a deep breath and let it go. I had spent too long holding on to people who did not hold me back, and now I was done with that. The next morning I received a text from an unknown number. It was my mother. She wrote, "I miss you, please call me," and I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure of what I even wanted to say. I had imagined this moment many times in different versions, some with yelling, some with crying, but none felt right anymore. I simply replied, "I hope you are well," and left it at that, because sometimes not saying everything is also a form of closure. December arrived with snow and quiet, and we decorated our apartment with simple things, paper snowflakes. Leo made candles that smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, and on Christmas Eve Marcus and I stayed up late watching old movies with mugs of cocoa while Leo slept near. By the day itself was peaceful. No chaos, no shouting, no fake smiles or secret resentments, just love and calm. We opened presents in the morning, small ones, thoughtful ones, and I watched Leo's eyes light up when he saw his new storybook and his little toy train, and in that moment I knew I had given him something better, not just the gifts, but the peace of a home where no one would ever slap him and tell him to stay quiet. I thought back to the woman I had been a year ago, how I had walked into that Christmas dinner trying to keep peace, trying to survive, and how I had walked out a different person, broken maybe, but also finally awake. And now, 1 year later, I was whole again, not perfect, not unscarred, but whole. Leo crawled into my lap that night, looked up at me, and said this was the best Christmas ever, and I held him close, breathing in his warmth, knowing I had done the right thing. I had chosen to protect my child, even when it cost me my family, and now I was building something new from that choice, something honest, something kind. And as snow fell outside our window, I whispered to myself, "I am proud of you," because sometimes you have to be your own witness, your own cheering crowd, your own comfort, and that was exactly what I had become. And in that quiet room with soft music playing and my son in my arms, I knew for the first time in a long time that I was truly free. Outro, this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.